A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. To all those friends who do not understand what I said right now, it's just my way of starting my videos on my YouTube channel. It's actually our traditional way of Muslims. The first phrase which I said was that it's like we request our God to pray us from Satan. And the second one is that we start our conversation with the name of God, and then I will say Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means that we have to that it's a greeting. We greet our viewers with peace. So all the non-Muslims who are watching it, they it's just for their understanding. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to discuss a topic, and it's related to a discussion which we had just a couple of weeks back, related to the war between Israel and Hamas and the Zionist propaganda and all that stuff. So today we are going to it's a relevant topic related to that, and we are going to discuss it. Let me tell you an interesting story. Just a couple of years back, I used to publish some books related to different ideologies and philosophies related to capitalism, socialism, communism, Marxism, and Immanuel Kant's theory of enlightenment, and all these, and the Western education system, and the typical education system which we follow in colleges and universities and all those stuff. So when I started my YouTube channel, like I started uploading videos regularly on my channel. Some viewers subscribed my channel only to watch my commentary and analysis on the Immanuel Kant theory of enlightenment. But unfortunately, for the past 3 years, I have been unable to comment on that. So right now we have a topic which is related to all these philosophies and ideologies, and as well as the the issue of Israel and Hamas. It's actually a global issue. So we are going to discuss about it, and it's about neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? And even experts say that neoliberalism is the root cause of all of our problems today in the world. So what is this neoliberalism, and how it is related to Zionism and all that stuff between Israel and Hamas? So for that, we have invited Mr. John Kofas from Greece, who is a professor of history, and he was with us a couple of weeks back, and we are honored to have him again. How are you, Mr. Kofas?
Good afternoon. I'm great. Thank you very much for inviting me again. It's a very important topic, and one that has received enormous scholarly attention, but also media attention in the last 20 years, especially after the Great Recession of 2008. That's when a lot of people all over the world began to take notice.
Okay, so what is this neoliberalism? First of all, we have to understand its what is its definition? What is its meaning? First of all, we
Yes,
have to understand it.
yes. Well, the fact neoliberalism implies that it is an ideology which is based on the classical philosophy of liberalism, and the father of the classical philosophy of liberalism was John Locke, who wrote a book entitled Two Treatises of Government during the Glorious Revolution of 1688-1689 in England. And he is considered, of course, to this day, the father of liberalism, on which other thinkers from the European continent as well as England built on the philosophy of liberalism. Now, Locke dealt primarily with the issue of limited government and individual rights. The role of government, again, we have to keep in mind this was in the 17th century, in the late 17th century, and Locke had the experience of growing up in a country that just a few decades before, in the 1640s, his country was involved in a bloody civil war where a lot of people lost their lives. And it was, as far as he was concerned, and people, like-minded people like Locke, because of the age of absolutism, in other words, absolute kings, tyrants, believing that sovereignty rests with the absolute monarch, not with the people. John Locke's view was that sovereignty rests with the people and not the monarchy and not the government, that the people, in fact, in what he argues is a social contract, empower the government to do certain things. In other words, governance, manage society. He limited those powers to basically protecting the life and property of citizens, which at that time, life and property, of course, life obviously pertains to every citizen. However, property, the fact is that in England in the 17th century, the large landowners, the aristocracy, the nobility, had most of the property. And then as far as shipping, manufacturing, because this was before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in England starts in the 18th century, later than Locke. But there was mercantile capitalism. There was a merchant class, and property, of course, could be in the form of shipping and trade and financing, small shops, obviously. So the property classes, Locke was interested in really supporting the bourgeoisie, the French word, the middle class, in other words. So his philosophy of liberalism emerges from the rise of the middle class in England, and his influences, interestingly enough, come from Holland. He spent some time in Holland, and Holland in the 17th century was a major capitalist country. So he was profoundly influenced by Dutch capitalism. He went back to England and argued that essentially government is like a company where the stockholders control the government. So the government is accountable to the stockholders. So that is the classical sense of liberalism. Now, in 1776, another Englishman, Adam Smith, an economist, took the Lockean philosophy and applied it to economics. And Adam Smith is, of course, the father of laissez-faire economics, of capitalist economics. So on the philosophy of John Locke, the political philosophy of John Locke, and the economic theory of Adam Smith of laissez-faire economics, in other words, lifting government regulation, restrictions, basically tariffs, because in the time of both John Locke and Adam Smith, governments throughout Europe had imposed heavy tariffs. So each country imposed tariffs on the products of other countries, the merchants, and the merchandise of other countries. And that sent, obviously, prices higher, and it also made the cost of doing business more. And Adam Smith believed that the solution was to end the tariff regime, to have laissez-faire meaning free enterprise, free trade, free enterprise. So that's basically that's where neoliberalism rests. However, the question is whether neoliberalism has anything to do with John Locke's and Adam Smith's uh, political and economic philosophy, respectively. And the answer is that it does not. Neoliberals do not believe in a laissez-faire state, in a state that is removed, except insofar as that removal pertains to permitting their capital to grow. In other words, they are definitely opposed to regulation, but they want the state intervention when it comes to corporate subsidies, when it comes to bailouts of banks, as we have seen, on a global scale, by the way. This has nothing to do with any particular country. This is on a worldwide scale. When it comes to fiscal policy, that is a tax system that favors business. And fiscal policy, I want to make very clear, is a mechanism which allows the government to transfer income from one group of people to the other. It always was, and it remains so. That's what fiscal policy is. Along with that, monetary policy, determining interest rates, is also very important. It was before neoliberalism. It remains so to this day, because the big borrowers are the owners of capital, where capital accumulation makes a difference in monetary policy. This is why business media, business newspapers, magazines, television, and so forth worldwide are concerned so much about interest rate policy, about liquidity, monetary liquidity, how much money the central bank of any country, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, Bank of Sweden, doesn't matter. The liquidity in the market makes a huge difference. So this is basically one aspect of it. There are other aspects. I want to give you just a very brief overview of how neoliberalism started its history. Neoliberalism, as a philosophy, begins to organize in 1938. An American intellectual, political scientist, and actually a journalist, Walter Lippmann, a very important, very famous person,
Yes, yes.
met with Friedrich Hayek, who is considered, by the way, the father. Hayek is considered an Austrian, the father of neoliberalism. They met in Vienna, and they not Vienna. I'm sorry. They met in Paris. And they had a conference in 1938. Now, that was a very odd year to have a conference on neoliberalism, because the prevalent economic system in many countries, from France, where they had that conference, to the United States, but also Latin America and other countries, the prevalent economic system was Keynesianism, New Deal economic policies. That is, the state not only regulates, it's very interventionist, and it follows a stimulative developmentalist policy. That is, it uses money, even money it doesn't have, through deficit financing, in other words, borrowing, issuing paper, bonds, to stimulate economic growth, to reduce unemployment, and bring about equilibrium in the economy. Now, the 1938, of course, was a very bad year. This was obviously still during the Great Depression, but it was also a very bad year because China had already invaded Manchuria and renamed it Manchukuo. So essentially the war between the Japanese and the Chinese had already started. They occupied it. Hitler invaded, the Third Reich invaded Austria, Anschluss, and they were planning to move east toward Poland, and then, of course, the rest of Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union. That conference basically went nowhere, except that it showed some divisions among the intellectuals. Some of them were more interested in the state having an interventionist role. There is a reason I'm mentioning the 1938 conference in Paris, and the reason is because neoliberalism came out as a reaction against, in the 1930s, fascism, Nazism, and communism. So neoliberalism has its origins as a counterpart, some kind of an economic system that would counter those, what they call the totalitarian systems. The question, of course, is whether neoliberalism was a departure, and to what degree it was a departure from that, and we'll talk about that. That conference, again, it went nowhere. 2 years later, it was full-fledged war. So in 1947, there was another conference. That's much, much more important. This was in Geneva, Switzerland. In this one, Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian, dominated. Karl Popper was also there, a famous philosopher who spent most of his time teaching in England. And I'll talk about him again later. But Milton Friedman from the University of Chicago was also there. So at that conference was important. Again, the year that it took place, 1947 was the year that Truman promulgated the Truman Doctrine, which started officially the Cold War. And the Truman Doctrine basically stated that the United States national interest is not defined in its own sovereign borders, but globally, wherever it has interests. And so what they did, in fact, it pertains to Greece. The Truman Doctrine pertained to Greece, Turkey, and Iran. The US announced in 1947, as this conference was the background of it, that Greece, Turkey, and Iran basically form a strategic buffer zone for the oil-rich Middle East, which the West wanted, the US obviously wanted. They felt that they had contributed enormous amount to winning the war, World War II. So had the Soviet Union, by the way. But the division of Europe was already a fait accompli. Since the Yalta Conference in 45 in Crimea, they had already divided Europe. And in 47, Truman decided, although the Americans had a debate about this issue, to have a clear-cut division in the world between East and West, the so-called embryonic stage of the Soviet-American confrontation. Now, by 1947, the U.S. had already established it as early as 1944, the Bretton Woods system, which Bretton Woods system, by the way, constitutes the historical antecedents, the historical background to neoliberalism, because a lot of what the IMF, the Bretton Woods system established the IMF and the World Bank, and then and those two instituted, the two sister banks. The IMF's goal was to provide monetary stabilization loans to countries needing to stabilize their currency because of inflation, and the World Bank development loans. And and those two institutions pursued policies of weakening the government of the countries that borrowed. In other words, to this day, those two institutions use loans as leverage to have a weaker state and a stronger private sector, especially the larger companies, not small businesses, but the larger companies and large foreign multinationals. So that's called conditionality, by the way, in the IMF lingo. In other words, if you want to get this money to stabilize your currency, you have to follow these policies. Deregulate your economy, privatize some public enterprises, provide tax breaks for companies and for the wealthy, weaken the labor unions because labor costs are part of the cost of doing business. So what you have basically with the historical antecedents of the IMF, and then the World Bank was right there providing development loans. For example, if a country wants to build an electricity plant and a water dam, they go to the World Bank for, let's say, 5 billion. The World Bank immediately follows the IMF measures, which are strong private sector, weak state public sector. Now, there were exceptions to this that the United States made, because the United States, by the way, controlled these institutions. And the exceptions were in Germany, where the US wanted Germany to reindustrialize. So they would not apply these conditions to Germany. Japan, which they had the exact same formula for Japan. They would not apply it to Japan. They would not apply it to Germany. Then after the Korean War, they would not apply it to to South Korea, and they would not apply it to Taiwan. So you have basically a political decision, because neoliberalism sounds like an economic system, but it's actually, as we'll see, it's a holistic societal system. I call it in my forthcoming book, social contract. It's a social contract. It impacts everything. It impacts everything in society, including the way people think. Now, one last thing, and then I'll stop here and you can ask me anything you like. One last thing, and that is, Assad, I want to make sure that we understand here that if we go to Google and Google neoliberalism, we'll find different definitions. The IMF is not going to have the same definition for neoliberalism they're going to that I just gave you. They're not going to have, if you go to Goldman Sachs, if you go to any site that is pro-neoliberalism, they're going to have a different outlook. It's not going to be the same. The fact is that there are, depending on the ideological and political perspective of the analyst, neoliberalism becomes, oh, it's just more of the same. It's more of John Locke, as I said from the beginning, and Adam Smith. It's just an extension of it in the 21st century. That's all it is, right? However, it is not. Go ahead, I'll pause here and then I'll continue how it was implemented on a world scale. But please, if you have any questions at this point.
Okay, so can you hear me, Mr. Kofus?
Yes, absolutely, of course, of course.
Quack, 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 quack.
Yes.
Okay, so how can we define neoliberalism in a simple definition? Like, if you have to define it in one single line, how can we define that?
Neoliberalism is a philosophy that is eclectic, meaning that it borrows from various other ideologies, not just liberalism. And the goal of neoliberalism is to strengthen capital, and in so doing, it necessarily implies weakening the working class and class war. While I was writing this book, this forthcoming book on neoliberalism, I interviewed Noam Chomsky, who's known, I'm sure, all over the world, because he's someone who had helped me early on in my career with a couple of other books. And I asked Professor Chomsky, I said, we started talking about neoliberalism, and he said, John, the thing is that neoliberalism, to me, is class war. It's class warfare. Now, Noam Chomsky has written on neoliberalism. He's talked about it on videos and so forth. And the fact is that it is a form of class war. It is a form, in other words, the capitalist class, the class that owns capital, basically sees as its enemy the working class, but also the middle class. So what we have is neoliberalism as a counter-revolutionary ideology. That's how I would define it, as a counter-revolutionary ideology.
So you mean to say that it's the concept of neoliberalism is to oppress the poor and to accumulate more wealth for the rich people, for the capitalists, if I'm not wrong.
Yes. The effect of the neoliberal policies with vast institutional mechanisms from the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, regional banks, the Inter-American Bank, for example, as well as national governments, the policies they follow, whether it was, for example, especially in Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro. Now Lula is president, and he does not adhere as closely to neoliberalism. He follows neoliberalism, but not as closely. Or in India under Modi, or in Turkey under Erdogan, there are, or in Israel, and we'll talk about Israel. The fact is, Israel is a neoliberal society. But under the cloak of Zionism, in other words, Zionism uses neoliberalism, and neoliberalism has been molded within that society. For example, in Israel, and we'll talk more about that. But in each country, for example, neoliberalism in the United States is not the way it is in Erdogan's Turkey. It's not the same as, let's say, in Argentina, for example. In Argentina, they just elected Javier Milei, this new president, who is an avowed advocate of Milton Friedman's economics of neoliberalism. But Argentina cannot have the same, because each country's institutions, its economy, its social structure is different. So it adapts to the national institutions. And it's the same thing with every country. Russia has aspects of neoliberalism, but within that system of Kremlin-linked oligarchs who obviously benefit enormously from state support. Neoliberalism, contrary to the word liberalism, which implies, free of the state hands back, it's actually a very interventionist system. Without the state, they would not be able to be doing what they're doing. The state has to have a policy. The question is, whose interest and for whose benefit is that policy formulated? And neoliberals know this. And this is why in many countries, the United States, of course, is notorious for this, where you have major campaign contributions, which I regard as investments in politicians to follow certain policies. For example, when Trump was around in 2017, he pushed legislation that gave back close to $2 trillion to the 1%, the richest 1%. That's state intervention. The state passed legislation to change the fiscal policy to give back this money. In other words, not to take. They were previously taking that money. They no longer. So the question is, how do they fill the gap? Deficit financing, in other words, they borrow, this issue bonds, the Treasury Department issues bonds. That's why the debt is at 34 trillion in the U.S. And the other thing is the indirect taxes, which are mass consumption taxes. The mass taxpayer, they pay a lot more in taxes, so they feel the burden, and their direct taxes go up. And so they get it from other sources, plus deficit financing. It's a very dangerous, very reckless system, as we'll see, as we'll get more into it.
Okay, so there is some confusing part over here. Uh, I said that the purpose of neoliberalism, which I understood was that facilitating rich people and oppressing the poor people, the working class people, and making them poor again. So, but I don't understand how can we differentiate it from capitalism. I think capitalism and neoliberalism, how are they
Excellent
both?
question.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you for asking the question. Capitalism has existed for 500 years. That's an example. I'm glad you asked. Assad, thank you for asking. The capitalism has existed for 500 years. The transition comes in what a number of scholars call the long 16th century, from about 1450 to 1650. There's a transition. There is a French school of thought, the Annales school of Fernand Braudel, who influenced some American thinkers, including Immanuel Wallerstein and Ander Goodert Frank and some others. And I was, being in graduate school in the 1970s, I was profoundly influenced by that school of thought, the French school of thought, which looks at the transition. Capitalism constantly evolves. It never stays the same. I mean, capitalism starts out, this is before the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism did not start during the Industrial Revolution. It predates the Industrial Revolution. It's the transition. A lot of people think it has to do with long distance trade. The fact is, it has to do more with Europeans transitioning in agriculture from subsistence agriculture and animal husbandry to commercial agriculture, animal husbandry, selling the surplus for profit. And that necessitated trade, and that necessitated eventually long distance trade. So the structure of the local economies begins to undergo a transition. Interestingly enough, by the way, this coincided in Europe, this transition, with a major natural disaster, the Black Death, it's called, from 1348, and it lasted up to 1500. And that basically was earth-shaking for the Europeans, that it forced a lot of changes in the social structure and the economy. Survival becomes very important. So the Europeans begin to look outward. They begin to produce surplus, and then they begin to look outward. They begin to go after the Arab trade routes and gold. And that's where when the Portuguese, who were the first to go to Africa, Northwest Africa, they were after gold. They didn't find any, but they found people, so they took the people. Slavery begins, the transatlantic slave trade. So capitalism begins from the mercantilist phase to the industrial capitalist phase to finance capitalism to the Keynesian state, which starts in the 1930s. John Maynard Keynes, of course, a brilliant British economist, very practical mind, who was interested in saving capitalism from itself. John Maynard Keynes had studied Marxism, but he wasn't a Marxist, but he believed that Marx was, after all, correct, that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. So he figured, okay, let's save it. And he did meet with Franklin Roosevelt, among other major leaders, political leaders in the world. And his system of deficit financing and equilibrium in the economy and unemployment theory prevailed until the 1970s, basically the oil crisis of the 1970s. The 1970s is when we transition out of neoliberalism gradually, with Margaret Thatcher's, well, actually, if I may, at this point interject something here about where the first country that actually is adopts neoliberalism institutionally on a nationwide, it was Chile. In 1973, I believe in September 73, Salvador Allende was overthrown with the assistance, of course, of the CIA. He was overthrown in Chile. The new regime was a military dictatorship. Augusto Pinochet was the new leader. And he invited, besides the CIA, he invited IMF, World Bank, but also University of Chicago economists. Eventually, Friedrich Hayek, the father of neoliberalism, as well as Milton Friedman, met with Pinochet in Chile. Chile becomes the first country in the world to test neoliberalism on a national scale, on a large scale, throughout society, in everything from trade to labor unions to education. And obviously, it was a disaster for the working class and the middle class of Chile. But it was a dictatorship. People, when people had no choice, it was a military dictatorship. The first developed country to develop it was Margaret Thatcher in 1980s, 79. She started talking about it. And Margaret Thatcher, England becomes, after Chile, England becomes the country to adopt neoliberalism. And then in 80, Reagan gets elected in the US, and he introduces neoliberalism in the United States. So neoliberalism takes shape in the 80s in the Anglo-Saxon world. And they insist on spreading it to the rest of the world. They insist on spreading it to the rest of the world, including Israel, by the way. The Reagan administration insisted that Israel also adopt neoliberalism. So it's, and not just Israel, but they actually, as much of the world as possible.
Okay, Mr. Kofus, you have just mentioned Israel about, that you have mentioned Israel about twice in this conversation. So as we said during when we were starting this conversation, how is Israel related to it, and how is this entire Zionism policies and all that genocide stuff and all that thing that is going on in Israel in the Middle East? How is Israel and Zionism, the creation of Israel, and Zionism is the root of this creation of Israel. It's because of Zionism that it's the philosophy of Zionism, due to which the state of Israel came into being. So how is Zionism related to neoliberalism?
Yes. Well, the thing is that Israel was pursuing developmentalist policies and policies that up to the 1980s that were designed to provide a social safety net, something that neoliberals wanted eliminated, the social safety net. Social security, in other words, Medicare, the social insurance, medical insurance, not Medicare, it's just the United States, national health care plans, free education, providing assistance to the poorest in society, basically social programs that take care of the entire society, by obviously using state finances, using funding from the state. Israel, however, limited its social safety net primarily to Israelis. In the Palestinians, because Zionism is an exclusivist ideology, Zionism is not an inclusivist ideology. It excludes, it doesn't include the chosen people, the population that is of the same faith, the Jewish population that is within the society. That's where those policies were targeted. Now, Zionism remains a constant in a capitalist system in Israel that basically changes over time from 1948 to the 1980s. In the 1980s, the IMF, the World Bank, private corporations, the United States, England, they were sort of pressuring, not sort of pressuring, they were pressuring Israel to begin to deregulate, to weaken the labor unions, to privatize, to weaken the social safety net, to provide tax breaks, to introduce lower tariffs. Okay? In other words, a prescription that fits the neoliberal mold. The Likud party was far more receptive to this. And they, although the others, by the way, sort of begrudgingly went along, but the Likud was more enthusiastic. So they begin to adopt neoliberal policies. However, the Israeli government, because as you pointed out, Zionism transcends the political economy. In other words, it's above it, right? The fact is that neoliberalism as a political economy and as a system that impacts the social structure of society, Zionism transcends. So the neoliberalism is subordinated to Zionism. So the question is how to mold it. Let me give you some statistics. Let me start out with those, and then I'll give you some examples. In 2021, 3 years ago, in other words, the per capita GDP of Israel was among the richest 25 countries in the world at around 57,000 a year, right? For Palestinians, 5 million of them, per capita GDP was around 3,000. That's about 5.5%, somewhere in there. About 5.5%. You're looking at a huge gap. It's not half. It's 5.5% of what the Israelis, for a Palestinian, right? You compare, the gap is mind-boggling. Why is this? And this is a good example. And again, I wish we had more time to discuss this at length, but this is a good example of how neoliberalism works, especially when it's subordinated under an exclusivist system. Now, exclusivist ideology like Zionism. The pattern of the Zionists was to subordinate not just the Palestinian society, but the Palestinian economy to serve the Israeli economy. So, for example, I'm a businessman. I have some capital. My uncle from France sent me some money. My Palestinian uncle from France sent, and I want to start a business. To start a business as a Palestinian, I have to get a permit from the Israelis. Let's say it's for let's call it a widget, X product X. The Israelis may give me permission to build a plant to manufacture the product in the West Bank or Gaza, or they may not. They may say, you can't do that. You, Palestinian people in the West Bank or in Gaza, have to buy that product from an Israeli company. Everything that Palestinians do must have a permit, including work. They have to have a work permit to work for the Israelis, basically, and also for Palestinians. But they have to have a work permit to work in Israel. Now, Palestinians constitute the cheapest labor force, and they have been used as a buffer in times when capitalism expands, because capitalism, by the way, expands and contracts. That's the nature of capitalism. It goes through periods of expansion and then contraction. When there's overproduction, it contracts. The Israelis actually found a cushion. They found a safety net in the Palestinians to soften the down cycle. In the down cycle, they simply don't issue the work permits and get rid of the Palestinian overflow workforce. And the Israeli unemployment rate stays rather steady. The other thing is that the Palestinians trade overall is predominantly with Israel. They won't allow them to trade with, just to give you the statistics, 80% of Palestinian trade is with Israel. Only 20% with the rest of the world. So there is no multidimensional foreign trade policy like Germany has. Germany can trade with anybody they want. Nobody will tell them who they trade with. Okay, except when the US puts sanctions. Then the US tells them who to trade with. But the fact is that in this case, when you have Palestine, 5 million people, an economy which is so trade dependent on Israel, who is, by the way, their government that doesn't exactly recognize their autonomy and uses their labor and uses them as a buffer zone and a pretext to keep the system at equilibrium. That is also a manifestation of apartheid. Apartheid is not just the IDF going out into a West Bank town, or as now in Gaza, and doing what they're doing. We know what they're doing. It's also the day-to-day stuff, the material lives of people. For example, let's say I'm a farmer, Palestinian farmer, and I need to dig a well to draw water to irrigate my crops. I can't do it unless I get a permit from the Israelis. Their whole lives depend on it. And they may say, buy oranges from us, buy olive oil from us. You don't grow your own. They may give you, they may not. So you have basically an economic neoliberalism, in this case, is massaged. Yeah, it's private sector. And of course, there are scholars who, by the way, have argued that an extension of neoliberalism is, as a lot of people know, that we have these settlers, these very aggressive settlers, a lot of them from the US, who go in and seize Palestinian homes, kick people out with the help of the IDF, of course, or the police, and they take over their home. That's called appropriation, which is a euphemism for stealing. But the fact is, neoliberalism is a form of stealing. It just has the legitimacy of the state doing it. The state formalizes it. When Donald Trump transferred close to 2 trillion from the state's finances to the richest 1%, that's appropriation. Where is that money? Who is going to fill that gap? That if they're not paying the 2 trillion, it's either going to go to debt, which means everybody else pays for interest on the debt because obviously they're issuing bonds, and they're going to have to kick in more money. So it's a way of the lower classes subsidizing the wealthy. In the case of Israel, it's the Palestinians subsidizing Israelis. So I know this may sound a little bit more complex and so forth because the way I'm explaining it, maybe I'm not explaining it. Some years ago, I was in Washington, D.C. There was a fella, an American Jewish fellow, who was arguing, he was in a lecture at a university, he was arguing that the way to understand Zionism is through neoliberalism. Unless you understand neoliberalism, you can't understand Zionism these days. He was arguing that we can only look at it from that prism, from that perspective, because the system is perpetual exploitation. And I mean, what people get up in the morning, they go to work. Guess what? You need a work permit. They go shopping. Well, the products, that 80% of the trade is with Israel. So this is utter dependence. And it's not at this equal level as an Israeli. This is at a subordinate level. This is at a lower level. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you were speaking some. Okay, you can complete it, and then I will ask.
Yeah, the thing is with neoliberalism in Israel, and a number of scholars, especially since I did want to make this one smaller point, since Trump's election, and then we of course had Modi who predated, and then Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Erdogan in Turkey, who also predated Trump. These are called authoritarian populist neoliberals. In other words, there is neoliberalism, French style and English style, which has at least a facade of electoral politics and following pluralism in society. And then there is neoliberalism that has a much more authoritarian tilt to it, where the state adopts authoritarian means to achieve its end. And a number of scholars have argued that the Israeli model of neoliberalism is obviously in the authoritarian camp. And some, including, by the way, Israeli scholars, I'm talking about Israel, who are really, they are in a position to have the most expertise. They're living in the society. They argue that model, unfortunately, may spread to others. May not, but they argue that it may very well spread to other countries. And it is the ultimate model of exploitation, so social exploitation.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yes, you can continue. I thought you have just completed it. Yes.
Yeah. One other thing, Israeli scholars also point out that when we look at statistics from the mid-1980s, when they started in Israel adopting neoliberal policies, to the present, what we see, this actually, I'm glad I thought of this because it's an important point to what's happening today. What we see is that the living standards for the Israeli working class itself, despite the fact that they have the Palestinians as the working class as a buffer zone on which they rely, they have been dropping as well, just as they have in the United States, as they have in Europe, by the way. Now, so it's not that neoliberalism has worked wonders for them. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, because this is the reason some of the critics of Zionism, Israeli critics of Zionism, mention this also, is the aggressive militarism, the settlements, the agitation, the destabilization of the Palestinians in Israel is intended to distract from this and argue, well, Zionism is the catalyst for unification among all of us, distracting from the fact that, guess what, your living standards have been going down. you know, so Zionism as an ultra-nationalist ideology distracts people to argue, well, there's a common enemy over there. Let's focus on them. Never mind your problems of lower living standards. Your consumption power is going down, but hey, we're facing the common enemy. So this is an important point also, because neoliberalism has, despite its globalization tentacles, by the way, because neoliberalism was, and in some respects it still is, and we'll talk about this more in a different context. But obviously there was a time, especially in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet bloc, when globalization was identified with neoliberalism. Well, now it's neoliberalism has been subsumed by nationalism in many countries, and even Japan, of all countries. Japan argued, the Japanese government argued, I think about a year ago or so, if I recall, that globalization hasn't helped us, it's helped China. China is the big benefit, which, by the way, it's true. China, which has not adhered to the neoliberal model strictly, it's taken aspects. China has benefited, interestingly, we'll talk about it in another context, but China has benefited from neoliberalism outside its own country, but internally, because of the legacy of communism, it's following a very mixed economic model, which includes social development. Neoliberalism is adamantly against social development, against the social safety net, against social development. Only vertical economic development. In economics, we use, many economists use the term vertical economic, in other words, growth that goes straight up for very few. And then there is horizontal, which is broad economic development for all of society, everybody benefits, which of course was the goal of John Maynard Keynes. Let's have horizontal development, which necessarily means you have to adopt social development. You can't not, Xi Jinping, the president of China, has been stressing this for the last 5-6 years. We have to have social development in order to achieve economic development. This is a very important aspect of it. Now, there is zero social development for the Palestinians, by the way, and social development itself in Israel, and even in the Zionist context, under neoliberalism, has also taken a back seat.
Okay, well, just a question came into my mind, and let's talk about our own countries. How is Greece affected by neoliberalism, and how is Pakistan affected by it? How can you see both these countries?
Okay, let's
start
start with Pakistan. Let's start with Pakistan. Pakistan is a very interesting case. The fact is, let's not forget that Pakistan was disrupted by 2 decades of US war and occupation in Afghanistan. That was very disruptive for Pakistan. Pakistan had no choice at the time. Well, it had a choice, but it would face the wrath,
Yes,
and
definitely.
they backed off. So they accepted
Pakistan can never
begrudgingly.
dare to. Actually,
Yeah. Yes. No. They figured, okay, there was basically an ultimatum. You have to let us use your country. We're going to go after Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, which was basically to bring about regime change. Um, and Pakistan was disrupted in the process. So but neoliberalism in Pakistan also comes under the within the institutional framework of Pakistan. Pakistan has a commitment to private industries, um, and a commitment to trade, which means also foreign investors. Now, Pakistan increasingly, especially in the last two decades, has been getting closer and closer to China. So Pakistan has followed and because China does not adhere to what's called the Washington Consensus, which is the neoliberal model that the US was advancing, China has something that Chinese scholars call the Beijing Consensus, which is, of course, evolved into the Belt and Road Initiative that they are following, which is an integrative scheme for the entire world. And Pakistan is in China's plans, part of China's plans for thorough integration, economic integration. Pakistan needs China. So Pakistan's neoliberalism comes with asterisks. It comes with certain conditions of having that close relationship with China, which does not follow the Western, it does not follow the Western consensus, it never followed it. It also has certain commitment to helping the capitalist class in Pakistan. And my understanding is, and I've written about this a few times, that there are certain people in Pakistan, very powerful people with a lot of money, just as there are in India, and they're very close to Modi, who obviously favor neoliberal policy. If I were a multimillionaire or a billionaire, I would favor it because such policies would favor my interest. They would simply bring more money into my pocket. It's that simple. Lower taxes, less regulation, subsidies from the state, all of this would be to my interest. Why would I follow that? So Pakistan is, in fact, part of the neoliberal global system. I mean, including the defense industry of Pakistan, which benefits from it. The question is, what has, again, as I said, I started out by saying 20 years of war between, the Taliban and the American forces there, and a number of other countries taking part in that. That was very destabilizing. When you have a country like Afghanistan right next door, and all that instability that was brought by that conflict, they're not friends to be able to follow, the model of neoliberalism freely the way they want to. They're going to be all sorts of constraints and modifications to the model. I think Modi in India, especially under Modi, has adhered to neoliberalism far more, partly because there are a few billionaires who are very close to him who benefit from it in a number of sectors, from shipping to commercial agriculture, as well as factories, but also corporations, multinational corporations that have an interest. Um, and Pakistan, of course, competes with India. And the pressure on Pakistan from the IMF and the World Bank has been follow the model of India. Look at India. Look at GDP growth in India. India is going to be the next China. So there's always that kind of um, pressure with two neighbors, which it's no secret in conflict and so forth, border issues and so forth. And so you have the pressure doesn't only come from government, it comes from international organizations and comes from the corporations themselves. You want me to invest, provide me, I'll give you a tangible example, provide me with the loan, with the financing to open up a factory, at least, for example. Let me just bring up a company that recently got such funny, Intel, the chip maker. Wherever they go, they demand corporate subsidies. They go to Germany, they get them. They just recently got from Israel. Wherever they go, they come to Pakistan. Pakistan has, and the message is the same. This is how the world operates. So you, Pakistan, have to do what India is doing for me, what Germany is doing for me, what Israel is doing. So there are no exceptions. So the formula is the same. As far as Greece, Greece is unfortunately, well, Greece is not to be compared with Pakistan. Pakistan has a much stronger economy. Greece is a very small country. It doesn't have much of, I mean, its economy is a couple of 240 billion, somewhere in there, GDP. The country is rather weak. It has always been um, dependent economically on the great powers, up to the Truman Doctrine on the Western Europeans, especially England and France. Now the United States, after that, after Truman Doctrine on the United States, now it's a combination of geopolitical dependence on the United States and geoeconomic dependence on the Europeans, Western Europeans. So Greece has been, like Pakistan, by the way, suffered austerity measures imposed through the IMF, but by the great power, by the Western powers. So, and this is common with the global South. Greece is not the global South, it's the Balkans and Eastern Europe. But the Balkans and Eastern Europe are not that far off from the global South. They're a little bit better off, I should say, but there's still a dependency relationship. So neoliberalism in these countries does mean much more capital concentration in the hands of very few families. Literally, obviously, Greece, as everybody probably knows, or a lot of people know, the big money is in international shipping, but historically, but there's also money in banking, some real estate, and so forth, the hospitality sector, and tourism place, basically. Pakistan is more diversified than Greece, much more diversified. So its economy, it has a much broader economic base. Greece has a much narrower economic base in that respect. So, and there is another thing with Pakistan has enormous potential, by the way, And that's very important. The potential of a country. Pakistan has the potential. Now, here's where the IMF and the World Bank, when they go in, as well as private corporations in Pakistan, and they want to persuade them more liberalism, is they use that potential aspect. And that's a very powerful argument to use because you have India next door. Don't you want that kind of development? And that is indeed very persuasive to adopt policies that presumably will get you that kind of growth. The question is, who benefits from that kind of growth? Who benefits from that kind of neoliberal growth? See, that if money is going to be concentrated, okay, GDP statistics are going to show, GDP growth, an impressive 5.5%. Fine. Who benefited from that? See, that's the thing that people, especially in the mass media, whether it's in the West or anywhere else in the world, they go, well, GDP growth is 5.5%. Good. What's the poverty rate? What's the level of socioeconomic inequality? You see? And this is where China has the upper hand, whether they're talking to Pakistan or to India or the rest of the world, to the Americans. And they go, well, they eliminated, Xi Jinping proudly announced a couple of years ago that they eliminated extreme poverty in China completely. And they're working toward greater social development and closing the gap, especially, by the way, China is an interesting, it's a vast country, obviously, but in the coastal region from Beijing all the way down to Hong Kong, that's where the money is concentrated. That's where you have high living standards. Now, it is true that in the western provinces, whether it's the south or the northwest, where there's a minority up in the northwest, the Xinjiang province, where there's a Turkic Muslim population that's minority. That area there, that region there, is the whole western region is, everybody knows, it's not as developed. Living standards are low. It's not the China of Shanghai. Now, the government in Beijing has argued that they're working toward more even geographic development. Neoliberalism, by the way, is not interested in geographic development at an even keel. In other words, they'll focus on wherever there is the greatest profit return. That's it. They could care less whether, Xinjiang province with this, which, by the way, the West constantly criticizes. Look at the Chinese, they're mistreating the Muslims. The fact is they have companies there that exploit that labor force. So they're making money from them. Okay, fine, criticize them. Criticize their human rights violations. And there are human rights violations, I'm not denying that. But you're making money. You have a company and you're exploiting their labor. Now, you can't really, this is where duplicity, and this is where the duplicity element comes in. And they go, okay, so you're concerned about the Muslims in the northwest province in China, but not the Muslims in Gaza, you see, who, by the way, are exploited by the majority population of Israel. Go ahead.
Okay, so what I have understood from this conversation is that neoliberalism has affected and impacted almost every government of the world. It's just that they have different definitions, they have different meanings to apply it, and everyone is following neoliberalism in some way. Am I right?
Yes. I'm glad you asked. Let me raise my the sound system. I'm glad you asked the question because a lot of people believe, and obviously that it's the way the media presents issues, that somehow capitalism, because it exists within the historical framework of the nation state. It's a national system. There has never been any such thing as national capitalism. Capital in the last 500 years has always been global, international. It will go wherever it can reach the highest return. However, here's where it gets complicated. The government of each nation state, of each country, determines policy for the businesses of its own country, as well as policy for those businesses that come in from the outside. So there is this facade that somehow there's national capitalism. That's not true. Capital is constantly moving on a global basis. The BRICS, the Chinese have made it very clear that that through the BRICS, they want to create this regional system of payments and trade. And they are strong advocates. In fact, in my view, the strongest advocates of globalization today are not the United States or Britain or Japan, it's China. And they have made no bones about it. No, it's not a secret. So you basically have an international system which is based on global integration. Capitalism was always based on global integration. However, capitalists themselves need the state, and this is where neoliberalism becomes important, to advocate for them. For example, Intel, which makes chips, okay, Microsoft, okay, with its software, they need the US government. So what does the US government do? Tariffs, sanctions, military destabilization as leverage. So geopolitics is leverage for geoeconomic goals. To benefit whom? Why are they doing what they're doing? For whose benefit? It's not just General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin and the companies that make everything from tanks to submarines that benefit. It's high-tech companies. When you go to Washington, D.C., and you pass through, you take the metro and you go through the Pentagon Station and then Pentagon City, the next one, you'll see huge advertising boards. And usually it's not what you would think. They would think it would be one of the big Raytheon, for example. Raytheon is a big defense contract. You would think it'd be it's high-tech companies because they do big business with a military-industrial complex. Banks provide the financing. So there is this web of companies that benefit.
Okay, Mr. Kofos, I believe that the questions are over on my part. Let's find out that neoliberalism has caused all the issues in the world. We have understood that. But how can we solve it? And as a final message to the viewers, I would like to ask the conclusion to the solution to this problem. And if there is anything which I have missed, which I have not asked you regarding this topic, you can discuss that as well. And you can, I request you to provide a solution to this neoliberalism issue.
I believe, Assad, that that these systems emerge out of market dynamics and political dynamics. When Walter Lippmann and Friedrich Hayek met in Paris in 1938, nobody paid attention to them. In 1947, they did. the world had changed. The United States was truly hegemonic. In my view, I have argued this, and a lot of people, uh, they want, what do you mean? That's not true. I have argued that the United States achieved the zenith of its power during the second half of the 1940s, all the way up to the start of the Korean War. That's when it was immensely powerful. It came out of World War II as the richest country, monopoly on the nuclear bomb, which it used, by the way, in Japan. Until 1949, it had that monopoly. In 49, Stalin announced he had successfully detonated the bomb. Okay. Now, it enjoyed in the 1940s, in the Truman administration, the early Eisenhower administration, enormous powers. It didn't need to follow an economic model of the 1930s, of the Great Depression. It could afford to move on to the neoliberal model. It did not do that. It kept the social safety net, and it kept aspects of Keynesianism. However, what happened is slowly, very slowly, the Keynesian model was withered away. The private sector was becoming more powerful, and conditions necessitated, because capitalists were arguing they were not making enough money, whether it was in France, in England, the rest of Europe, or the United States, by the oil crisis of the 1970s. And that's when they moved to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, in other words, came out of the pressure from the private sector, the banks, large corporations, and intellectuals like Hayek and Friedman and Karl Popper. Basically, these people were just articulating what the business people wanted. These people are not driving policy. They're articulating. They're not the reason that these neoliberalism was not the cause of it. If Wall Street and markets around the world didn't want this, it wouldn't happen. And governments, because you have to have the political will, obviously, did not implement these policies, they wouldn't be happening. I believe neoliberalism, and I'll tell you, that's a great question, because there are scholars who believe neoliberalism is finished. There are scholars who believe that it's in its twilight. There are scholars who believe that it's just going through a phase and it's still there. I believe that, unfortunately, that it is evolving. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I believe that it is evolving toward the much different phase, which I suspect is authoritarian. And I don't see a return to Keynesian economics. I don't know what will emerge out of the ashes of neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is just a phase. It's been around for about 40 years now, for 4 decades. I think it's going to last a little bit more, maybe a lot more, but it's definitely going to be, eventually it's going to wither out. Something else is going to come in its place. I don't see social discontinuity on a world scale. I don't see it in any nation state. I do see authoritarianism on the rise. The solution, in my view, is obviously material, a political economy, and a social contract, which is very important, a social contract that caters to the needs of all citizens, not just to the richest, whether it's 1% or 5% or 10%. And neoliberalism doesn't do that. Neoliberalism caters to the very richest.
Okay, so Mr. Kofus, I believe that. Do you want to suggest anything to viewers regarding it?
Do I would I like to suggest? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Uh,
Do I like?
do uh, do you want to suggest anything to viewers regarding this neoliberalism topic and anything?
I think that the viewers should. Uh, this is a very complex topic, which has many aspects to it. In my own forthcoming book on neoliberalism, I deal with neoliberalism in higher education. I deal with neoliberalism and artificial intelligence. There's a whole chapter just on artificial intelligence and neoliberalism. There is neoliberalism and foreign affairs, how neoliberalism impacts foreign policy, neoliberalism and the labor movement. So, I urge viewers to research it and study it on their own. It impacts their lives. They may not realize it because people go about their lives. They get up in the morning, they go to work, and they don't think about neoliberalism. What does that have to do with them? Everything. Their job is part of the neoliberal model. The money they make, the money they borrow to buy a home, or the rent they pay, all of this is part of the neoliberal system.
Okay, so well, we just discussed. You just discussed that all of our things were, including our education, including our, professions, our incomes. Everything is a part of neoliberalism. So,
Including Assad, including if I could jump in here, because I conclude with this, our own self-identity. Neoliberalism impacts culture. It impacts
okay,
culture. So our own sense of identity is profoundly influenced without realizing it. Who thinks about their identity? About their identity? That's a philosophical question. People that just don't think about it. But it influences us. We, as human beings, people under neoliberalism, have become more commoditized. It's a much
okay.
more hedonistic society. You see it in social media. You know that better than me. You're younger. You know you deal with this stuff. You know that that's the reality of it. The younger generation, they don't even think about it. They're immersed into that culture, and they don't stop to reflect. What is all this?
Well, what I have observed in my life so far is the young people are not concerned about these philosophies, what is going on in the world. They are not even concerned about their own local politics. And so international current affairs are nothing of their interest. They are so much involved in their, they are studying, they are playing, they are, the young people, they are, they're, I don't want to offend anyone, but what I feel is that they
No,
are,
I agree.
uh,
I agree.
yeah,
That is that sense of narcissism that you're addressing right now. That is part of the neoliberal culture. The worldview of narcissism that emanates from the neoliberal ideology.
so we have discussed an introduction of neoliberalism. It has been a very detailed conversation, and I hope that all of you have understood what neoliberalism is and how it's impacting the global economy, the global politics, and as Mr. Kofus just said a few minutes ago, that it's impacting our culture, it's impacting our own personality, and we don't understand it, we don't realize it. So we are going to have a discussion on how this neoliberalism is going to it does affect the education systems in our next session. And I'm thankful to all the viewers for their precious time, and I'm also thankful to Mr. John Kofis for uh, accepting our
Thank you,
invitation
Asad.
here.
Thank you.
Yes, it's my pleasure, and I'm honored and thankful to host you. And definitely, we are going to conduct another session, and we are going to discuss this next topic in detail. Thank you, Mr. Kofus, for your time, and thank you all the viewers
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Thank you.